Hi, my name is Diane Carey, and I'm an architect with the Department of Justice. I've worked with the Department of Justice for 28 years, surveying various facilities nationwide. I've surveyed several types of facilities, including public schools, and I'm here to talk to you today about how to make your public school accessible. We're going to talk about accessible schools in general, and we're going to talk about barriers getting to school. We're also going to talk about barriers that exist getting to classes in other areas of schools and architectural barriers getting to activities. First thing we're going to talk about is accessible schools. A few years ago, some news reports came out that said many of America's schools aren't fully accessible for students with disabilities. These reports were based on a report that the U.S. Government Accountability Office prepared based on surveys that they had sent out to school districts nationwide. Also, the GAO went out and surveyed on site approximately 55 schools located in 6 different states. And their findings were prepared, and they put a report together stating the different types of accessibility barriers that they found. And what they found was that approximately 2/3 of U.S. public schools have barriers to access for students with disabilities. First, we're going to talk about providing accessibility to get to school. Many students arrive to school on buses, but many others also drive or are dropped off by parents. So accessible parking has to be provided for students with disabilities and also for visitors with disabilities. Accessible parking has accessible parking spaces with access aisles, such as shown in this photo. And you also have to have, in addition to accessible parking spaces for cars, van accessible parking spaces. And a van accessible parking space is a parking space with a wider access aisle, as shown in the photo. Van accessible parking spaces are necessary for lift-equipped vans so that when the lift deploys into the access aisle, there is sufficient space for somebody in a wheelchair to get off the lift and go onto the sidewalk. You have to have 1 van space for every 6 required accessible parking spaces. You also have to have signage. There isn't any signage in this particular photo. Each accessible parking space has to be identified by a vertical sign with the international symbol of accessibility. The international symbol of accessibility is the wheelchair symbol that we are all familiar with. In addition, van spaces are required to be identified with signs that say van accessible. Also, accessible parking spaces can't be used as passenger loading zones for buses. They must be available at all times. The GAO report also found that curb ramps and ramps accessing school entrances were too steep. They exceeded the maximum allowable slope of 1 in 12, or 8.33% when measured with an electronic level. Walkways also tended to be too steep. The running slope of a walkway, which is the slope in the direction of travel, can't be more than 1 in 20, or 5%. Walkways also can't have openings that are too wide or changes in level greater than 1/4 inch. In addition, the cross slope of walkways, and the cross slope is the slope side to side or perpendicular to the direction of travel, can't be more than 1 in 48. It has to be basically level. If your schools have inaccessible entrances, then they need to have directional signage indicating the location of the accessible entrances. The directional signage should be located so that an individual with a disability does not have to backtrack or retrace their steps. Accessible entrances should be identified by the international symbol of accessibility. Entrance doors to school often have multiple barriers. Entrance doors have to have door hardware that is usable without tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. Hardware such as doorknobs is not accessible because it requires tight grasping and twisting. The door hardware shown in this photo also is not accessible because it requires tight pinching behind that metal plate in order to open the door. Accessible doors should have a maneuvering clearance that is level in all directions, so an individual with a disability can open the door without rolling back. If the maneuvering clearance is not level, then you can use an automatic door opener so that an individual with a disability can open the door using the automatic door opener. If you use an automatic door opener, you cannot turn these off. They have to be on at all times so that they are usable whenever the school building is open. In addition, many schools are putting in security features at this time, and one of the things they're putting in are check-in counters in the main office. And the check-in counters often don't have low counters for somebody who uses a wheelchair. There has to be a low counter, and the controls for the computer equipment must be within reach range. Right, I'm going to go over the requirements for walkways. If you're going to review the walkways around your school for accessibility, you want to look at the following features. You want to look at the slope in the direction of travel. You want to look at the slope perpendicular to the direction of travel. This is called the cross slope. You want to make sure that the walkway doesn't have any changes in level greater than 1/4 inch vertical. And you want to make sure there are no surface openings greater than 1/2 inch wide. And oftentimes these surface openings happen in between pieces of concrete or where the concrete has degraded and it has worn down over time. All right, I'm going to go over the things that we just talked about. We talked about the importance of providing accessible parking and also providing van accessible spaces, and then providing each accessible parking space and van space has to be identified by a vertical sign. And you can't use the accessible parking spaces as a passenger loading zone. On the route to the school entrance, curb ramps and ramps can't have a slope of any more than 1 in 12 or 8.33%. Walkways can't have a slope any more than 1 in 20 or 5%. They can't have gaps that are wide or changes in level that are too high. The cross slopes of walkways has to be nearly level. If you have inaccessible school entrances, those must have directional signage indicating the location of the accessible entrances. Accessible entrances must be identified by the international symbol of accessibility. Entrance doors should have accessible door hardware that doesn't require tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. They also must have maneuvering clearance in front of them that's level in all directions. If the door doesn't have level maneuvering clearance, then an automatic door opener can be used. If an automatic door opener is used, then it must be on at all times that the school is open. And if the school has a security check-in area with a counter, a low counter for an individual in a wheelchair must be provided. Now I'm going to talk about getting to classes and other areas of the school. A lot of times schools have barriers to access such as stairs between different levels of the school. This is often the case in existing schools and older schools. And you really have to look at this on a case-by-case basis and look at and see and try and determine if can a platform lift, an incline platform lift be provided, or if there's only a few steps, can a ramp be provided to access the different level? Another barrier to access that may be located in corridors is protruding objects. Protruding objects are a barrier to access for individuals with vision disabilities. And protruding objects located within the circulation path, and the circulation path is wall to wall in the corridor. If these objects have a bottom edge that is mounted too high, and that's higher than 27 inches above the finished floor to the bottom edge of the object, and if they protrude out too far, and too far would be 4 inches into the corridor, then they're a protruding object. If you have a protruding object, you want to make sure to provide some kind of permanent cane detectable barrier so an individual with a disability does not walk into them. Classrooms have to have sufficient clear width in between the tables or the desks so that students that use wheelchairs can access all parts of the classroom that are accessed by other students. This would include getting up to the front of the room to access the teacher's desk, to ask them questions, to access the chalkboard or the whiteboard or the bulletin board to be able to review assignments. Also, the desks or the tables have to have sufficient knee space underneath for a wheelchair. Specialty classrooms, such as science labs, oftentimes have high lab counters. You want to make sure that within a science lab, that at least 1 out of every 20 science stations has a low lab station. Areas of the classroom that are used by the students, such as sinks, should have a low sink counter. Storage for science items such as goggles and beakers should also be low. Toilet rooms often have multiple barriers to access. One of those being no turning space within the toilet room. There has to be at least a 60-inch diameter turning space or T-shaped space within the restroom so that a student with a disability can enter the restroom and turn fully around and exit the restroom. Features of the restroom that also have to be accessible are things like mirrors. The bottom edge of the reflecting surface has to be low enough for someone in a wheelchair to be able to see themselves. Pipes underneath sinks have to be insulated or configured against contact. Toilet compartments have to be wide enough. And they must have grab bars on the rear wall and on the side wall. All right, I'm going to go over some of the items that are wrong in this toilet room in this picture. There are no toilet grab bars on the rear wall or on the side wall. The toilet clearance is obstructed by the movable chair. There has to be sufficient toilet clearance between the toilet and the sink so that an individual in a wheelchair can make a transfer onto the toilet. There's no pipe insulation underneath the sink. It's important to have for the pipes to be insulated so that somebody who doesn't have any sensation or feeling in their legs doesn't accidentally get scalded. The paper towel dispenser and soap dispenser control are too high. They're outside of an accessible reach range. And the doorknob requires tight grasping and twisting of the wrist. All right, I'm just going to review some of the things that we talked about as far as getting to class. In existing schools and old schools, the corridors are often inaccessible because there's stairs between the different levels of the school. Within hallways, there's often protruding objects that protrude out too far into the corridor and aren't detectable by the sweep of a cane. Classrooms often have tables and desks that are too close together. Science labs don't have lab stations that are low enough, and they also don't have sinks and storage areas that are low enough. And toilet rooms contain multiple barriers. They don't have sufficient space for a 60-inch diameter turn. They lack insulation for pipes underneath sinks. Mirrors are too high. Paper towel dispensers and soap dispenser controls are too high. And the toilet compartments aren't wide enough, and they don't have grab bars. Last, I'm going to talk about getting to activities and other common use areas of schools. Libraries and media centers oftentimes have seating in between the book stacks, and they don't provide sufficient clear width in between the table and the stacks. A minimum of 36 inches is required for an individual in a wheelchair to access the books. Cafeterias often have tables with built-in seating, but there's no clear floor space for a wheelchair. Auditoriums often have numerous barriers to access, including no wheelchair spaces that are integrated into the seating area, and no accessible route to the stage. An accessible route to the stage is important for children that are attending award ceremonies or graduations, so that they can go up to the stage with the rest of the students. Play areas also often have numerous barriers to access. The biggest one being that the play surface isn't stable and firm, and it's not compacted. Numerous types of play surfaces can be found in different types of playgrounds, including sometimes you'll see playgrounds with sand or gravel or mulch. All of these are not accessible surfaces. The surface that is shown in this photo is actually engineered wood fiber, which is small pieces of wood that are cut up and, when installed and compacted correctly, provide an accessible play surface. However, the surface that's shown in this photo is not accessible because it's not stable and firm and it's not compacted. The play surface also has to meet an outside industry standard called ASTM standards for wheelchair maneuverability and for impact attenuation. Also, another problem that's found is that the clear floor space adjacent to transfer platforms onto the play equipment and onto seats is not level. The clear floor space must be level to provide a safe transfer onto the equipment. Play areas can also be surfaced in rubber tiles, and some of the barriers that you may find on a rubber tile play surface include surface openings that are too wide and changes in level. Stadiums and athletic fields often have the metal bleachers with ramps up to them. And these bleachers are often used, to watch sporting events or graduations. And when GAO was doing their surveys, they found that a lot of these metal ramps had slopes that were too steep. I'm going to review play areas right now and some of the things that you may want to consider when you're looking to provide an accessible play surface. You want to make sure that the play surface is firm and stable. You want to make sure that it provides wheelchair maneuverability and that it complies with the appropriate ASTM standard for that. You want to make sure there are no changes in level greater than 1/4 inch and no surface openings that are greater than 1/2 inch wide. Most important, you want to make sure that the surface is maintained. It has to be compacted to maintain the firmness and stability and the wheelchair maneuverability. and there needs to be a level clear floor space at transfer platforms and at seats. I'm going to review now some of the things that we talked about for getting to activities and to common use areas of the schools. In libraries and media centers, you want to make sure that the route to the stacks is a minimum of 36 inches wide and that furniture isn't intruding on that route. Cafeterias should have a clear floor space for wheelchairs at the cafeteria tables. Auditoriums need to provide wheelchair spaces within the fixed seating area and an accessible route up to the stage. Play areas should have play surfaces that are stable, firm, and slip resistant. They can't have excessive slopes at the clear floor space for transferring onto platforms and seats. They can't have gaps that are too wide or changes in level greater than 1/4 inch. And the surface must meet the wheelchair maneuverability standards of the ASTM standard. And also, most important, play area surfaces must be maintained. For stadiums and playing fields with bleachers, the ramps up to the bleachers can't be any steeper than the maximum allowable slope of 1 in 12 or 8.33%. In summary, 2/3 of U.S. public schools currently have barriers to access. Providing accessible public schools requires accessible routes to the entrances and accessible entrances, accessible corridors, classrooms, and toilet rooms, and accessible common areas and activities. If you want additional information on how to get your school accessible, look at www.ada.gov. My name is Diane Perry, and I'm with the Department of Justice. Thank you for listening.